I'm Elise Chaffins, and I'm here today with Rowan Haber, the director of the documentary We Are Pat, premiering at Tribeca Film Festival. Thank you so much for joining me today, Rowan. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
So, just to start off, can you tell us a little bit about your just love of the SNL character Pat?
Yes, absolutely. So I encountered Pat when I was in middle school, and um, basically I realized recently that I came to Pat through the band Ween because I was obsessed with the band Ween, and Ween was in It's Pat the movie. So I saw It's Pat the movie with my best friend at the time, and we just were immediately obsessed with Pat and thought that Pat was like the funniest thing ever, and just Pat became sort of like an itch in the back of my mind that really like imprinted on me in my childhood, and then I forgot about Pat for about 30 years, and then as one does,
Yeah,
and,
yeah.
and then I was at like a Sundance dinner at this weird steakhouse in Burbank, and we were joking about sort of like misguided 90s movies that should never be remade, and I just blurted out like I want to remake It's Pat, and I hadn't even thought about Pat in so long, but they were kind of just sitting there right at the top of my mind. And by then, I already identified as trans, so I was like, "Oh, interesting." And I went back and watched the film, and I still laughed. In fact, I laughed like just as hard as I did before. But I also realized that I was like laughing at myself, which was kind of
Mm.
a strange feeling. And so that was something that I wanted to interrogate, and hence the film.
Yeah, awesome. One of the things I think this film does really well is that it talks about this gap between intent and impact. Um,
Yes.
so yeah, can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, I think this is something that, like, as humans, we just all sort of navigate, right? Like, we can have really good intentions around something, but, the impact of our actions is something that we don't necessarily always have control over. And so, I think in the case of Pat, Julia's intention was not to cause harm to gender nonconforming or trans people or make fun of them in any way. It was really, she was just trying to get a hit sketch on SNL, and this sketch sort of took off, and people really liked Pat. And I don't think that she was, also her language around transness and non-binariness and all that was very different back then. Not to say that it didn't exist, but it was different. And so I think that she didn't really know. And then of course the sketch became it had an impact that she hadn't really bargained for, which was that suddenly people were kind of identifiable as Pats.
Mhm.
Like people would be like, call someone a Pat if they're, gender nonconforming as kind of like an insult. And so I think that hurt like a lot of people in a way. And then also was Pat sort of acted like this cautionary tale for people, like if I am a Pat, then no one's going to love me. I'm going to be illegible by society. People are always going to be acting really weird to me. It's just kind of like honestly, I think for a lot of the folks that I talked about, like seeing Pat as a kid made them kind of scared for like, oh no, like I shouldn't be that. So I think that was some unintended impact that it had, but certainly like Julia is like really lovely and open-minded and like a champion of queer and trans people. And so she's not, that's certainly not at all her intention.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that she was a part of this documentary. I just
Yeah.
thought that was so great. And her scene when she goes and speaks with all the writers is just really a
Yes.
powerful one. Um, can you just talk about that scene and just how that might have informed, like, as you're editing together the rest of the documentary, how that kind of worked together?
Yeah, definitely. So, it's a hybrid documentary, and so we have interviews with trans comics and academics and Julia, and then we have archival footage, and we also have a writer's room where I bring all the trans comics together, and we try to reimagine the original Pat sketches from a trans perspective. And so, we did this writer's room over 2 days at one of our producers' houses in Hollywood. And on the last day, I brought Julia in to meet the writers. And it was really meaningful because I don't know, I think that you look at the way that things are created, and, because Pat was such a massive hit back in the day, like you wouldn't necessarily think like, oh, I'm gonna get to talk to that creator and ask them questions and sort of interrogate them around their intentions. Like it's something that you never necessarily imagine asking someone to be accountable for, but the fact that
Mhm.
Julia was willing to show up and have that conversation, um, and that the trans writers really like welcomed her was really powerful. So basically she came in the room, we had the round table of writers, and they just talked about, you know, how she created the sketch, and the writers shared the impact that the sketch had on them, and some of them shared the negative impact, and but some of them were really everyone was just really loving and jokey, and um you know, and they really like enjoyed each other. I think it was kind of a love fest, and Julia is a very charming person, so she's very easy to love. So I think it was, I don't know, it feels like a kind of corrective to a lot of the like
Mhm.
really charged discourse that we have around different perspectives, you know, in our current culture.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that kind of stuck out to me in that scene was just the way, and Julia kind of talks, and I don't know if this is a spoiler, but she talks a little bit about how like creating Pat kind of helped her with some of her own like perspectives as a cis woman on like femininity and all of that kind of thing. And I find that so much. I have trans kids, and I've found, and two non-binary kids, like,
So,
yeah. And so, like, I know for me, like, that's been one of the things is like in speaking with trans people and getting to know them, it gives me just a deeper understanding of my own self, and I think that's
mhm.
really important. And I think that kind of shows through the film. Can you just talk a little bit about that as well? Because I think sometimes you get into it's a trans movie, and like then it kind of
Yes.
like exempts a group of people. But yeah,
Yeah, no, definitely. And I want it to be, it's not you know, it's a movie with trans people in it, but the film is really for everyone. And I think, you know, we have almost this cultural feeling that like only trans people experience gender or something, you know, or like, and it's not true. Like everyone has their experience of gender, and sort of like the ways that that influences and affects them, and oppresses people, and you know there's just a lot of, or delights people, you know, there's everyone has their own experience. And so one of the most powerful moments for me was understanding how Julia had her own sense of pressure being a cis woman at that time, the early 90s, in the comedy world, trying to make it in a boys club of SNL, and basically, you know, that and also her mother had these sort of expectations on her being a woman that were very sort of traditional. And so Pat offered this funny escape for Julia, you know, which I don't necessarily think was conscious at the time, but when she looks back on it, she's like, yeah, it was just a joy getting to be Pat because I didn't have to like be pretty, and I didn't have to like, you know, act a certain way, and you just got to kind of be a person, like a goofy person, you know. It's like, so I think, I don't know, I think one of the takeaways I would love for people to get from the film is just that, like, you know, trans people, while we have a different experience than cis people, we're not exceptional. Do you know what I mean? We have, everybody experiences gender. Everybody takes, not everybody, but like a lot of cis people take hormones. You know, it's like men when they're aging and women when they're aging take
yeah,
estrogen and testosterone, and people have breast augmentations and reductions and face, you know, it's everyone has surgeries and takes hormones, right? And so it's,
right.
I think the rhetoric around transness now is just, you know, certainly on the right is sort of just like, oh, this is so crazy, you know, and it's really not that crazy. It's everyone does gender affirming things.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other things that I really appreciated about this film is the way that it grapples with like loving problematic things.
Yes,
Because I
totally.
know I think for myself, like I have a couple of just like, but I still really love it.
Yeah, yeah.
And I kind of love the way that you and the other comedians kind of work through that in the film. Can you just talk about some of the conversations that you had, like as you're trying to redeem Pat?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I think we just I think we looked at like the intention, Julia's intention, but also, yeah, we just, to your point, I think it's just accepting that duality of like loving something and also knowing that, yeah, it's kind of fucked up. And like, I think looking at it within the cultural context
Mm,
is really helpful when you're considering like how do I wait, like for example, like The Simpsons. I love The Simpsons. The Simpsons is amazing, and yet like the character of Apu is like really offensive. It's there are a
right.
lot of offensive things about The Simpsons, right? But it's I think that we can sort of hold both things and know both things, and and I asked the comics too. I was like, what do we do with these sort of cultural objects that have aged badly? Do we just strike them from the record, or do we examine them and have discussions? And everyone was like, we examine them and have discussions because otherwise, then you're not learning from anything. So, and I'm not saying that all things should be redeemed. Certainly not. I think there are certainly lines when things are really overtly like hateful and racist and homophobic and transphobic and ableist. Like those are not things that um, those aren't things that I think if they're really hateful should be redeemed. But I think Pat is not that.
Hmm.
So I think there's a line there.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's really interesting because I think sometimes there's this idea of even discussing problematic things means it's just you're canceled or whatever. And like,
Yes.
I appreciate that this movie did a good job of not canceling Pat, I guess.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah.
we can acknowledge that something maybe isn't awesome in its
Yeah.
entirety, but also recognize some of the like benefits that it has as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I mean, Pat really did have different meanings for different people.
Hmm.
Like one of the wonderful comics who I interview, who's also a show creator, Abby McEnany, who did Work in Progress. There was a whole storyline on that show about Pat and about how Pat was hurtful to her. And that is her experience, and I don't have the same experience as Abby, and I like, and she's amazing. I love Abby, and she actually in her show handled Pat in such a gorgeous way. But people have different lived experiences, even if they have some things in common. Um, and so I think it's possible to kind of acknowledge those things and and interrogate them a little bit, but not cancel anyone, in a sort of like dismissive
Yeah.
way. I'm not saying that things should never be canceled, but I am saying like I think when there's a question, like ask someone a question that, get in touch with someone and be like, hey, what did you mean by this? And
Hmm.
I think in Julia's case, it's really to her credit that she was open to answering that call because a lot of people would have been like, I don't want to talk about it.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think when you kind of touched on this here is that I really love that this film incorporates so many trans voices that really did have different experiences with Pat. How important was that to you as a filmmaker, or did that just kind of come up as you're making the film, just to show that like plurality of viewpoints?
Yeah, that was important for me. I wanted people from like across the spectrum of, gender and race and class and size and I did my best to do that. You don't always hit that, perfectly, but it was important for me to get different, takes on that because, people did have different experiences and there are people that you wouldn't even imagine who had like Brontez Purnell, who is a dear friend and just a brilliant artist, was like, yeah, I got called Pat,
Hmm.
and when you look at him, you're not thinking Pat, you know, so it's interesting how, and he related to Pat in different ways, right? So it's everybody just had their own perspective on that. And in the film, I had to be sensitive in that, like, for me, Pat is pretty positive.
Right.
And for like JD Sampson, Pat is pretty positive. And then for others, Pat was actually very hurtful. So I had to, you know, be sensitive about that and so ride that line myself.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. So just yeah, you kind of mentioned a little bit this earlier, but just yeah, what are kind of the takeaways that you would hope that people would get from We're Pat from watching it?
Yeah, I want the takeaways to be, one of the main takeaways is just that I think that we can, I mean, I've already said this, but I think that if you have a question or if you feel upset by something, then it's your first step shouldn't necessarily be to like write it off. It should be to try to have a conversation. And then
Mhm.
I think that we can have conversations even though we come from different perspectives. And I mean, specifically, I would hope that this really applies to the left, politically. It's like our enemy is not Julia Sweeney. The enemy is the right, It's like so, and it's kind of like I think we may have differing opinions, but rather than infighting, maybe we can actually just come together. And as a country too, I would love for people to be able to have kind conversations, despite political, affiliation. I think that that would be, I mean, I hope that the film shows that like you can have these kind of conversations with people, you can be kind to people, and you can have different opinions. So that's one thing. And then I think the other is that, trans people are funny and flawed and complex and nuanced, and we're not just like tragic, and we're not just coming out all the time, and we're not just fighting for our rights all the time. It's like I love it when Grace Freud and April Clark, who they're a comedy duo called Girl God, they're just like we ask what brand is your comedy, and they're just like, our comedy asked the question, what if two trans women were fucking idiots? And it's like, I just love that, So, yeah, I think those are two big takeaways, just that like kind of, um, that transness is something that is nuanced and complex, but also not exceptional in the sense of we all do gender affirming things and we all just are people at the end of the day. So I think those are two takeaways I want people to leave the film with. And the third being like that we should clearly bring Pat back into it to spin off into a whole show written by trans and gender nonconforming people and
There we go.
Julia. So
I'm here.
yeah. It's Alex. That's what we're gonna call it. It's
There we go.
Alex. Yeah.
Well, thank you so, so much for speaking with me today. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Cool.